finals, after grading, 40 people, both here and online watching. So science and religion, I asked my children this morning, I had 4 of them, I asked my children, what do you think of when you hear the word science? So my 10-year-old says, well, we're doing a science fair at school and it's all about simple machines. So I think it's about simple machines. Then my 8-year-old said science projects and having to do them in school. And my 6-year-old said worms. Because in her science in class, they were doing worm races in the playground at school, and she thought it was the coolest thing because she got to play with worms. And then my 2-year-old said poop. So, I mean, I guess that works. So there is science around everything. And I think the beauty of hearing my children say 4 different things speaks to the vast array of things that we've studied and the things that we can learn from science. Now, at the Center for Catholic Studies, we focus on the Catholic intellectual tradition, and that is a 2,000-year-old conversation with various disciplines like science, right? So for over 2,000 years, this conversation has been happening, and for 25 years, this is the 25th year of this program, of this seminar. So for 25 years, of that 2,000 and plus years, the Center for Catholic Studies and the Center for Vocation and Servant Leadership here at Seton Hall have been trying to foster that conversation, that dialogue, looking at different disciplines and how they intersect, how they're interwoven, and how they ennoble each other. And so this topic of science and faith, or science and religion, is one that is talked about quite a lot, actually. Here at Seton Hall in the past year, this is the 3rd or 4th program that I've been a part of that focuses on this topic. And I think it's worth exploring more and more. And I'm very happy that we have Dr. Lawrence Principe here with us from Johns Hopkins. And again, thank you to all of you for coming out in the beginning of your summer. So I think we owe a great gratitude to everyone who made this possible. But also, again, thank you. I'd like to invite up Father Jerry Bonapane to offer our opening prayer.
Thank you, Matt. It is very, very good to be here with all of you. My dear friends, let us pray. Almighty and eternal God, as today the Church celebrates the Blessed Virgin Mary's visit to her relative Elizabeth, we reflect on Mary setting out in haste and wonder on journey. In our own journeys of life, may we, as Mary, always magnify your greatness, O Lord. May we do this by exalting in your abundant and beautiful creation, best done by our embrace of faith and science. Yes, you are the God of electrons and black holes, the God of DNA and mitochondria and single-cell organisms. You are the God of H2O and CO2 and so much more. May our minds be open to the delights that can be revealed through religion and science and technology. May we be open to questions and mindful of your grace revealed through Jesus Christ, the origin of all things, the Alpha and the Omega. May these 3 days of seminar enrich us to bridge more closely faith and science in our own teaching and research as we continue to strive to make known the unknown. We are grateful for Dr. Principe's availability to be with us. Continue to bless him in his outstanding scholarship. My dear friends, may we all exclaim with Mary, my soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Father Jerry, for that thoughtful invocation. Just a final word of welcome and a brief introduction of our speaker and facilitator for these next few days. My name is Dr. Gregory Floyd. I am a professor in the Corps for at least 30 more days and director of the Center for Catholic Studies. And as Matt said, this is our 25th seminar. for a quarter century, Dick, as the founder of the Center for Catholic Studies, Father Colin, Linda, and Francia in the Center for Vocation and Servant Leadership have been co-sponsoring a forum for doing the constitutive work of the university, right? Friendly conversation in search of deeper understanding and the production of knowledge that results in teaching and communication. That's what we're here to do. And hopefully to do it in an environment that's a little more relaxed, right? And generative of insights and collaboration. So thank you to Father Colin and Linda, Francia, Danute, Matt especially. He's still here after a year, folks, right? Remember that first year at Seton Hall? Now he knows where all the bodies are buried. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Lawrence Principe, professor in both the Department of the History of Science and Technology and also the Department of Chemistry at Johns Hopkins University, a joint department for each of his PhDs, one in history from Hopkins and another in chemistry from Indiana University. Dr. Principe's research is extensive. I think I counted 11 monographs on his CV this morning. It includes a focus in the early history of chemistry, especially its relationship to alchemy. I just got back from 2 weeks in Rome with 60 college students. There was a lot of alchemical moments, shall we say. They're doing great. They're going to come home tomorrow. I came across Larry's work for the first time actually when two friends, both double pirates, both Seton Hall alum, introduced me to his course. He recorded a course with the Teaching Company, which among other things produces the Great Courses series. And Larry has two, one on the history of ancient and medieval science, and a second, which will be the ground of our conversations over the next few days on the history of science and religion, and their dialogue, conflict, etc., perceived and real. The course itself was an exercise in both erudition and what Lonergan, who many of us are familiar with in the room, would call the functional specialty of communication. Not only grasping what is the case, but grasping how to communicate it in ways that other people can understand and benefit from. I was struck as I spent a few weeks with Professor Principe listening on my commute to and from Seton Hall, that he demonstrates not only the intellectual care and rigor of our shared academic profession, but also perhaps the less ubiquitous and more important intellectual virtues of wonder and generosity. I know we will benefit from these same virtues over these next few days together. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lawrence Principe.
Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. Thank you all for being here. I thought I would start by just saying a little something about how I'd like to run the lectures over the next 3 days and what the topics will be so that you get a sense of where we're coming from and where we're going to. So I broke things up into 3 different sort of overarching topics. So today is what I call our historiographic day. We're going to look at where the idea of a conflict between science and religion, that is an unavoidable conflict or warfare, where does that idea actually come from? And what are its foundations? Why is it popular? And so forth. So next, tomorrow is what I call our historical day. And so we're going to look at one famous account, that is, of course, the example of Galileo and astronomical novelties in the 16th and 17th century. And then the second lecture will be about the scientific revolution in general, that very fervent period of scientific development in the 16th and 17th century, and what it means for the science-religion dynamic. And then finally, on Friday, we'll end up with what I call a philosophical day. And in this case, the first lecture is going to be, maybe a little bit more tough sledding because it's very philosophical about the problems of causation, what causes the things in the world. Because the longer I think about the issues of science and religion, the more I see that the issue of causation is really at the center of it. We don't understand how things come to be and how causes act, then we're liable to fall into all kinds of erroneous ideas about the relationship between science and religion. And then we'll talk about one theological development of the late 17th century, still popular today in some circles, but I would like to sort of stamp it out because I think it was a bad turn for Christianity to make in the late 17th century, which is called natural theology. Well, a particular kind of English natural theology, and I will suggest a different kind of natural theology with which to replace it that I think is much better, in my humble opinion. Okay, so also, I guess you've gotten some readings and we can talk about that. I'm gonna start today by talking about, as you can see, the dubious origins of the so-called conflict or warfare thesis. And the way I'd like to do this is, I very much like questions because I want to meet you where you are and answer your questions. You've probably come with questions. I hope I will generate some questions for you. So I'm going to just start talking about this issue, but hopefully stop at some point in the middle, several times I hope, to stop and ask if you have questions. If something is really burning, just wave at me or something and I'll stop. Okay? All right, so where I'd like to start is by trying to understand a massive change in the relationship between science and religion that took place between the early modern period, say the 17th century, and the 20th century. Now down to the 18th century, what we call science and religion, and those terms have shifted their meaning over time, but what we call science and religion had a relationship that was largely irenic. Now, of course, there were unavoidable disputes, and disputes arise whenever human activity and diversity of opinion occurs. So I don't think that conflict is necessarily prima facie a bad thing. There's obviously controversy within religion, controversy within science, that's how we develop. But what I'm trying to say is that the very common idea of a perpetual warfare between science and religion throughout time, where did that come from? In the 17th century, religious motivations, far more than anything else, drove the scientific process. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. So today the situation is quite different. There are, of course, many scientists who remain of a religious temper and many who continue to see a religious imperative to their work. Nevertheless, there are many others, both scientists and members of the lay public, not to mention some, dare I say, less well-informed religious figures who imagine it impossible for science and religion to coexist. So how, why, when, and by whom did this transformation take place? So I'm going to start with the two major architects of the notion of a conflict or warfare between science and religion. John William Draper, who is the more interesting philosophically, and Andrew Dickson White. Where I really need to start is to say that their model, this model of conflict or warfare, has been rejected by every historian of science alive today. No historian of science believes this at all. Nevertheless, it remains not only widespread, but naturalized as a fact in popular culture. In fact, I like to compare it to a pernicious biological species that's been introduced into a new environment, because the conflict thesis has been difficult to eradicate despite the continuing efforts of scholars best qualified for the task. So the two late 19th century books that were the conflict thesis's chief vectors were John William Draper's A History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, published in 1874, and Andrew Dickson White's A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, published in 1896. Many of my historian colleagues have already pointed out and refuted the melodramatic history and dubious facts upon which these books rest. I'm not going to do much of that today because honestly, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. They're so bad. Others have explored the social, intellectual, and religious contexts that allowed the formulations of Draper and White to establish themselves despite their obvious intellectual failings. But less studied are the origins of Draper and White's notions. And that's where I'm going to start today. So, strikingly, the enunciation of the warfare model appeared quite suddenly and almost fully formed in its modern version. That is, let me define it, an unavoidable, eternal conflict between science and religion throughout history from two authors within the same short time interval, from 1869 until 1873. So, very short period of time these both come out. So, to start, Andrew Dixon White first aired his warfare rhetoric in December of 1869 in a lecture entitled The Battlefields of Science, which he delivered at Cooper Union in New York. The text was published the next day in the New York Daily Tribune, and shorter accounts appeared elsewhere. This was one of the books I suggested that you have a look through, and we can talk about some of the content of that later. He published an expanded form as The Warfare of Science in Popular Science Monthly in 1876, and then as a slim volume, which you had a look at. After a decade of relative silence, he was busy with other things, which I'll get back to, he took up the cudgels again, and from 1885 until 1895, provided Popular Science Monthly with 25 articles, all entitled New Chapters in the Warfare of Science. He then cobbled it all together in 1896 into a ponderous 2-volume A History of the Warfare Between Science and Theology in Christendom. Now, historians have regularly seen the warfare as a response to criticism from clergy and denominational colleges aimed at White during his work to found Cornell University, he was the first president of Cornell University, as a non-sectarian institution. But that masks the key part of the story. The golden apple of discord for White's warfare was actually the Moral Land Grant Act of 1862. So the Land Grant Act gave large tracts of federal land to colleges in each state to be sold, where the money would be used to found new colleges, or to finance colleges, I should say. So in 1863, the New York legislature voted to give the money to a small struggling college called the People's College. The People's College had certain requirements to be met. They could not meet them, and so the Senate had to reconsider what to do with the money. Well, at just this time, Andrew Dixon White was elected to the New York Senate and made head of its Education Committee. Well, he killed the bill to give the money to the State Agricultural College and the People's College. He proposed instead that the funds be used to found a new college. Well, White, eventually in concert with another senator by the name of Ezra Cornell, introduced a bill to this effect. And unsurprisingly, once the land grant funds seemed up for grabs again, every college in New York State was wanting their piece of them. And of course, at that time, essentially all the colleges in the United States were denominational. That was the norm. So they all lobbied for their own share of the funds, and they opposed White's bill. Well, after contentious debate, a lot of legal maneuvering and backroom horse trading, the White-Cornell bill passed the state assembly in 1865. Well, following these political machinations to get the money, it's not difficult to see why the disgruntled losers would continue to voice their criticisms, and therefore, as I would have done, harbor suspicions of impropriety when one senator who sponsored the bill quits the Senate to become the new college's first president, and the other senator has it named after him. So, to what extent religious sectarianism played any role whatsoever in the squabbling over federal funds is open to debate. It is extremely implausible that White was correct in attributing it to reactionary sectarian zealotry, as he calls it, against non-sectarian Cornell University. So the military metaphor that White always applied to the relationship between science and religion appears in all of his writings. He seems to have loved it. He was in love with military terms. He called his bill a signal for war, described the other senators and the colleges as the enemy, He dramatized the whole process in the Senate as a succession of struggles, dangers, and fresh enemies. Well, in sum, I would argue that he confected the warfare model in a response to personal criticism and retailored historical events to suit it. A contemporaneous response to his book now appears to have been substantially correct in stating that, quote, "This book is an indiscriminate and uncritical agglomeration of facts brought together for the support of a thoroughly one-sided and fatally misleading proposition. A piece of special pleading like this was not worth writing." Ooh, I know how I would feel if someone wrote a review like that of one of my books. That didn't seem to stop him, however. What remains really difficult, honestly, for me to fathom is that this guy was, in fact, the president of the American Historical Association. How on earth did he justify to himself the way he lied through his teeth in his book? So, for example, the things he does, they're absolutely extraordinary. You may have noticed something like this if you read the part, this nonsense. Now I'm going to get on my soapbox about the one thing that all historians of science make sure every person they ever meet knows when they leave his company. The business in there about Columbus showing that the earth was round. Kill me, right? Historian of science moment. People in the West have known the sphericity of the earth since the time of Aristotle. Aristotle didn't even bother, he just listed the arguments and let it go because everybody already knew by the 5th century BC. So the idea of Columbus going to fall off the end of a flat earth, it's nonsense. Where does it come from? So it actually comes, how many of you were actually taught this in school at some point? Right? Okay. It comes out of Draper and White's books. So even if you've never heard of their books, they still have had an effect on you and on our common cultural society. So if you go to White's book, okay, he uses a footnote about, he has this long passage about the theologians of Salamanca telling Columbus that he was a godless pagan, and he's gonna fall off the end of the earth, and blah, 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 and quoting scripture at him. And then you go, okay, where do you get these facts from? Go to the bottom of the page, Irving, Life of Columbus. Okay, Irving, Life of Columbus. Irving who? It's Washington Irving, the author of Headless Horseman, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle. It's a fictional account of Columbus. And yet he uses it like a historical source. How can anyone who's supposedly a historian and head of the AHA do something like that without knowing what he's doing? Come on, people. I mean, that's not even possible. Even worse, when he talks, if you've ever heard, again, the canard, that the Catholic Church forbade dissection in the Middle Ages, again, completely untrue, but it comes out of these books again. He tries to prove this with a quotation out of St. Augustine's City of God. And he's got a footnote, City of God, book 24 or something. Okay, fine. And it sounds, when you read it, like people who dissect human bodies are horrible, terrible beings. Yeah, but if you actually go to the source, he truncates the sentence in the middle and never gets to the end, where St. Augustine says, but if people should dissect the human body, they would be amazed at the beauty of its internal functions, the harmony of the places, how it's put together and so forth. He just cuts that part out. This is completely dishonest in my opinion, and I can't see any way that one can justify it. So, did he believe, lawyer and politician-like, that historical accuracy could be subjugated to the goal of winning an argument at hand? We don't have him around to ask. All right, so enough with White. I think he's kind of boring, he's over the top, he's just, I think he was just, must have been a nasty, cranky guy. Or very insecure, or both. John William Draper is actually more interesting. His salvo rests on a more philosophical basis, even though his historical evidence is no less fabricated. he built up a position that he believed explained all of history in a number of works that preceded his 1874 conflict between religion and science. So a little bit about Draper. He was born in England. He was the son of a Methodist minister. He came to the United States in 1832, took up a job as a professor, first at Hampton-Sydney College, and in 1839 as professor of chemistry and physiology at NYU. In 1876, he became the first president of the American Chemical Society. I'm a little embarrassed that he's a chemist, speaking as a chemist myself. During the 1830s, he published primarily on chemistry. In the 1840s, on plant and animal physiology. In the late 1850s, he turned almost exclusively to history. Now, you might think all these different wide-ranging publications might be somewhat eclectic. He just sort of traveled where he was interested in going. But actually, when I came to read all of his books, and they're all very long, they actually form a coherent philosophical trajectory that I think is really interesting. Very wrong-headed, but also very interesting. So his thought can be characterized as an obsession with law. His sequential interests represent an expanding campaign of what I call hegemonic reductionism. Everything in the world, everything, I mean everything, being reduced to law. So the sequence begins in 1844 in his treatise on the forces which produce the organization of plants. There he proposes that the growth of plants, quote, unquestionably depends upon the laws of physics, and he refutes the possibility of any guiding vital force that allows plants to grow. He takes the obedience of celestial motions, the motions of the planets, to a single common law where, quote, no invisible or extraneous hand ever intervenes as his model, and asserts that all of nature is controlled by a uniform law. His 1856 textbook on human physiology develops the theme. Its constant refrain throughout is that external influences, particularly climate, cause metamorphoses of the human body and thence of human societies. Now, what suddenly makes an appearance here is the explicit influence of the positivism of Auguste Comte. Claiming that all metaphysics have fallen into disarray, Draper asserts the need for a new guide for human thought and declares that, quote, this guide is positive science. So Comte's business with his law of three stages is he divided all of human history into three stages. The religious or theological, the philosophical, and the scientific or positive. And for him, living in the first half of the 19th century, the French Revolution marked the end of the theological period. It was followed by a philosophical period, which he saw as Napoleon's attempt to reground society on rational law, and his own age as the beginning of this scientific or positive phase where all of society would be governed by science, or by the highest science, which he called sociology. I believe he coined that term. So Draper's new devotion to positivism offers a blueprint for future authorship. He writes, according to the methods of positive philosophy, that's his reference to Comte, there are but two classes of facts which can be admitted into our discussions representing man, those furnished by his structure and function, in other words, the human body, and those gathered from his historical career. So his next book, his previous book on human physiology expounds the first, and Draper's next two books would expound the second. The guiding principle of his 1863 intellectual development in Europe is, quote, the analogy between man's advance from infancy through childhood, youth, manhood to old age, and his progress through the stages of civilization. He says here, he has a law of now 5 stages rather than Comte's three, where the inescapable influence of uniform law, predominantly the effect of climate on physiology, governs the development of human individuals, human societies, and the human race as a whole. The single argument of the book is that the government of the world is accomplished by immutable law. So you can see where he's going with this. Now, he actually wrote one of the first histories of the American Civil War, published in 1868. This is his proof that societies advance in a preordained and inevitable course. He says the Civil War was an inevitable effect of this universal law because the differing climates of the northern states and the southern states caused their inhabitants to differentiate into two different groups, however you want to call it, into different types is the word, which came unavoidably into conflict for supremacy. Future peace therefore requires a constant mixing of northerners and southerners to avoid the reemergence of divergent types. He actually says that had there been more north-south travel in the 1840s, the Civil War would not have happened. I'm not making this up. All right, so human actions count for little or nothing. We are all subject to inescapable laws that are external to ourselves that predestine both individual and collective actions and outcomes. Draper's universal law of development applies equally to everything, from inanimate physical, chemical, and astronomical systems, through plants and animals, to human individuals, society, and civilization as a whole. So, in fact, it's a largely consistent chain of constantly expanding argumentation from the 1840s to the 1870s. So how, then, does the conflict fit into this? Well, unsurprisingly, his law of development undergirds the work. His obsession, and I have to keep using this word, his obsession with law, it's actually kind of freaky when you read it, in fact. His obsession with law leads him already in the preface to apply what sounds like a modification of Boyle's gas law to the science-religion dynamic, because he summarizes the entire history of science as, quote, a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on one side, and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interests on the other. So he then promises that he's going to give us a book, quote, with every page glistening with facts, a clear and impartial statement that does not advocate the views and pretensions of either party. Well, what follows is neither impartial nor factual. And if you thumbed through it, if you could stand it, you are well aware of this. Much of the book's historical material is cribbed from intellectual history, but with a significant difference: the book's hysterical tone. The conflict is specifically an anti-Catholic rant. Now, Draper considers Protestantism, quote, the twin sister of science. So therefore, he says that anytime Protestants have ever persecuted science or scientists, it is due to, and I quote, incomplete emancipation from Catholicism. For him, Islam is the Southern Reformation, carried out by a people benevolent to science and progress. Catholicism, on the other hand, is the brutal enemy of science, progress, and civilization. And I quote, Roman Christianity and science are recognized by the respective adherents, are they really, as being absolutely incompatible. They cannot exist together. Mankind must make its choice. It cannot have both. Well, any attempt at a scientific or impartial analysis is swept aside in a torrent of inflammatory rhetoric built on cherry-picked, contorted, or simply fabricated facts. So this attitude is traceable to three factors. The first is the contemporaneous American panic over Catholic immigration. Draper, apparently very conveniently forgetting that he himself was an immigrant, refers to the insidious agency of immigration and the dangers of what he calls a hybrid population. He remarks how Catholic immigrants keep regions where they settle, quote, in a lower intellectual state. Second, there's Draper's family history. Draper Draper's father, you'll remember, was a Methodist minister. Well, he was a convert to Methodism. That conversion to Methodism caused his ostracism by the rest of the Draper family, who, you might guess, was in fact Catholic. Draper's sister Elizabeth, who emigrated with him from England, converted to Catholicism while in America, and he threw her out of the house. Now, in a wonderful and potentially divine act of balancing the scales, I once met Draper's great-grandson. In fact, one of Draper's grandsons became an Anglo-Catholic priest. Yes, all right. So third, actually much of the Draper family is very embarrassed of their great-grandfather, because actually quite a few of them are now Catholic. Third, conciliar and papal declarations in 1864 and 1870 helped drive Draper over the edge. In 1864, Pius IX issued a syllabus of errors listing philosophical positions that he considered erroneous and contrary to religion. Absolute rationalism, the denial of God's action in the world, and these are two things that are deeply embedded in Draper's metaphysics. In 1870, the First Vatican Council spoke out against materialism, defined papal infallibility, reasserted the role of faith in human life, defended Christian education, and emphasized the role religion should play in governing and guiding society. And so Draper surely saw such statements as directly opposed to his devotion to positivism and his challenges to his deterministic universal law of development. Of course, Draper completely ignores the historical context of these events, as well as, in fact, Pius IX's notable embrace of new science and technology. First post office, first railroads were in the Papal States, and he reestablished the Academia dei Lincei, a scientific academy to which, ironically enough, I have to figure this one out, Draper would actually be elected. Draper may well have imagined that his attacks could finish off the Catholic Church, which was at that time deeply shaken by the contemporaneous seizure of Rome, the rest of the papal lands, the virtual imprisonment of the Pope, and the forced secularization and dispersal of Italian religious institutions. So I think what's really important here is it would be a mistake to see Draper as simply anti-religious. I don't think he was. His conflict implicitly and repeatedly promotes a religion of his own devising, a theology that's opposed to Christianity and particularly to Catholicism. His theology has several clear features, all deriving from his idea about immutable law. Draper's religion is overtly anti-Trinitarian. He claims that the doctrine of the Trinity was introduced from Egyptian paganism, as was veneration of the Virgin. This is why he labels Islam as the Southern Reformation for introducing monotheism in opposition to Christianity, which he implicitly casts as polytheistic. Well, interestingly enough, his somewhat bizarre adulation of Islam led to this remarkable graphic that appeared just after his book came out. You can't read it at the bottom, but it has a little doggerel verse there. Now by the holy prophet's beard, the Paynim Draper cries, and flourishes his scimitar before St. Peter's eyes. 'Tis I who am infallible, as all the world doth know, by science bright and Islam's might, 'tis I that tell thee so. Very peculiar. In fact, I've noted that if you go to websites that you really probably shouldn't go to, there are some jihadists who have taken up Draper's book as an example of the superiority of Islam. Oh. Good for them. All right. So let me just continue and I'll stop in just a moment. Because of his operation of universal law, miracles are forbidden. By forbidding God from ever intervening in the world, which would upset the inviolate law, Draper creates an entirely non-providential God and essentially deifies his universal law. He praises what he calls the fatalism of the Arabs as insightful resignation to the absolutism of impersonal law. Now, the really weird thing, and I wish I could get to the bottom of this, is that his hero and religious teacher is actually Ibn Rushd, or Averroes. Actually, it's a caricature of Averroes, the medieval Iberian Islamic philosopher. He defends Averroes' doctrine of the emanation and absorption of the human soul, which he proves by appealing to the conservation of force. He condenses the entire activity of the Spanish Inquisition to suppressing Averroes' ideas, which he equates with scientific ones. And he fulminates against Vatican I specifically for condemning what he sees as specifically Averroistic doctrines, pantheism, emanation and absorption of the soul, and so forth. So what he's really doing is he's championing a deterministic, pantheistic, pseudo-Averroistic religion as the one true faith, and does not hesitate to condemn in the roundest terms any, especially the Catholic Church, who dare object to it. So in the end, I would say that his book is not so much about a conflict between science and religion, it's a conflict between Draper's religion and everybody else's. Okay, so let me just take a break there. I still want to talk about the reception and the impact these books have had, but if there are questions right now that I can answer.
Can you just go back a few sentences?
Yes.
Pseudo-Averroistic.
Yes, so it's very strange. I don't know what of the philosopher Averroes he actually read. Whatever he read, he didn't read it very well. Because it's not truly Averroes' ideas. It's a sort of weird popularization of his ideas. So Averroes has the distinct distinction of being considered heretical by all three of the Abrahamic religions.
So then it's contradictory to his support of Islam.
In a sense, yeah, because I don't think he knew very much about Averroes, honestly. And this is the case with everything in Draper. His whole thing about climate is so bizarre. I worked very hard to try and figure out where he's getting his ideas from. And many of them are coming from French sources, which are already a generation out of date or more by the time he's writing, from Lamarck and Comte de Buffon. And my guess is, well, he was English, which means his comprehension of foreign language was probably pretty shoddy. So I rather think that he was reading these French sources and not really understanding what they said. I mean, his idea about climate, he says that, if a person could live long enough and was born at the North Pole, because it's cold, they would be born white. And as they moved south, they would get darker and darker and darker until they got to the equator, when they would be black and have black children. And then if they kept going further and further south, they'd be white again. And it's just like, where are you getting this from? My colleague, who's a historian of biology, I talked this over with her quite a lot, and she was able to identify some possible sources for his ideas. But her comment was like, it's like a cartoon of them. It's like a cartoon. So I find it interesting, his philosophical trajectory, but the foundations for it are so weak and so buffoon-like.
Yes.
A sort of related question to Sarita. So in core 2, we teach Ibn Rashid or Averroes, Maimonides, and Thomas Aquinas. So it's like a really fun week. I tell the students get a lot of coffee. So we talk a little bit more about like the relationships between them. So I'm so interested in his maybe misreading of Averroes, and I wondered if you could speak a little bit about how immigration affected his anti-Catholicism. And then I don't know, but is there any kind of like maybe problematic Orientalist like obsession with the East going on there with Islam? I don't know, like I've read, I'm an English person, so I've read some novels, with the whole Orientalism thing. I don't know if that's what's going on, like maybe because there weren't at that time, I don't think, as many immigrants from that area. So perhaps it was easier for him to idealize and then, be angry about the Irish, maybe Italian. That was just, I don't know if that was what was
He also doesn't like Chinese immigration, because after the Transcontinental Railroad is published, he publishes a little tract on you've got to put them all on a boat and send them back.
Wow, yeah.
So the thing that he seems to like in Islam is he has an idea of it as being very fatalistic.
Okay.
Which there is a certain reading of Islam that is like that. It's not necessarily the correct reading of Islam, but it's his reading of it, and it's always his reading. It's peculiar, and in fact, there were quite a number of reviewers that pointed this out. It's like this is not even Islam. What he seems to like with the Averroes, he's really thrilled with this idea of the reabsorption of the soul and the unicity of the human soul, and I don't know why that is. It's just maybe it's easier to deal with one thing than a billion of them. That may be. But, you know, when you read his work, if you actually take it to heart, it is the most depressing, horrible thing, because we have no free will. We have no ability to change our society, because we're all the victims of climate. And so it would be interesting to see what he thinks of climate change, but that is all going to do to us. He even says at one point, how the Romans talked about the Northern Europeans as being blue-eyed and red-haired. Well, there aren't that many blue-eyed, red-haired Europeans in the North anymore. Why? Well, it's because we invented heating. And so they all come inside now, and so the average temperature they are exposed to throughout their lives is higher, and so they look more like Southern people now. I don't know what else to say. It's just, it's kind of ribald at some level. You know, as a historian, we do not make fun of our predecessors for not knowing something. But in this case, he's using these bizarre sources that are totally misinterpreted and totally misunderstood, and putting them together into this, well, I find the philosophical system interesting just in and of itself as a confection, but just putting them together in bizarre ways. Cartoonish, as my colleague says.
The whole thing about the climate change, I mean, that kind of sounds Lamarckian.
Yeah, exactly.
Without understanding timescale or genetic inheritance.
Absolutely.
If you said over generations and generations and generations, there might be that kind of shift. I mean, nobody would really stop that. It's like he's taking Lamarckian,
Exactly.
making it more so.
Right. He's sort of, well, that's what I think my colleague was saying. It's sort of cartoonish. It's like taking Lamarck and running with Lamarck. You know, but 50 years after Lamarck, or 60 years after Lamarck.
So I don't get this guy, but so if you go to White, could you speak a little bit about sort of the cultural shift or the environment that was happening at universities? I mean, I get White's motivation. I mean, universities were the center of knowledge for centuries, especially medieval universities, and that was all about knowing the mind of God and theology and natural theology, as you mentioned earlier. But you're having a shift in this era in the 1800s towards science, and you're having it towards the establishment of Johns Hopkins University,
Exactly.
Cornell University,
MIT.
all these universities are happening. There's also the counter reaction of places like Seton Hall because of Draper's issues of establishing Catholic universities to counteract and yeshivas and different things like that. But could you talk about why this was happening, especially in the U.S.?
Yeah.
In the U.S. universities, I mean, Hopkins is sort of a copy of the German university, and then you have the British universities, which kind of shifted away from the theology towards bureaucracy, and the Queen needs bureaucrats to count her money and such. But could you talk about sort of that dynamic?
Yeah, that's certainly not my speciality, but what I can say is that I think much of it has to do with a kind of utilitarianism. It's an economic
Is that what
utilitarianism.
science is effectively, what this guy's trying to do and what
Yeah,
he's trying to do?
honestly, and in fact, it's what the Land Grant Act was for. It was not just to have liberal arts colleges everywhere.
Right.
It was to have agricultural and engineering colleges.
Right.
So there is a motion from the government in 1862 to change the character of the American educational landscape. So that's coming from
So
Federal
that, was that
government.
part of the separation of church and state that was happening in the American, I'm talking about the American context,
Yeah.
not the European, Western?
I don't think so. I think it was more practical. I think, you're here in North America with huge amounts of resources, a hugely growing population. Oh, I didn't tell you the thing about Draper population, that's my favorite, which I will if I have time at the end. With a huge population, huge amounts of land, so agriculture, industry, natural resources to be used. So all of this makes sense. The MITs, the Cornells, and so forth, all the land grant colleges make sense in that context of a kind of economic, social development, economic development model, I think. Okay, let me just finish up. I just have a few more things I wanted to say, and then remind me to tell you the population thing if I forget, because it's too funny for words. Okay, so how was this book received? Well, shortly after its publication, Scribner's Monthly wrote that, quote, "A more hasty, pretentious, incorrect work claiming the title of history has seldom fallen into our hands. The book is swarming with statements which are either positively erroneous or put in such a form as to be misleading." John Fiske, writing for The Nation, observed that Draper, quote, "depends upon a very superficial conception of religion, for the word religion to him is no more than a symbol that stands for unenlightened bigotry or narrow-minded unwillingness to look facts in the face." And so forth. So despite such negative reception, Draper's book became a bestseller. It was translated into multiple languages. It sped through scores of reprintings and fresh editions. Amid the negative press, it was part of the International Science series, and it outsold every other book in that series. Why was it so popular? Well, amid all the negative press, the constant champion, not only of Draper's book, but also of White's, was this man, Edward L. Yeomans, a publisher and popularizer. This shouldn't surprise us because it was he who commissioned Draper to write Conflict in the first place. And the preface to Conflict appeared before the book's publication in an article entitled "The Great Conflict" in Popular Science Monthly, the magazine that was founded and run by Yeomans. And it was also this journal that published all of White's stuff. So both of these two characters come together at this man. His Popular Science Monthly reveals a consistent view on science, society, and religion akin to the notions spread by Draper and White. He published there his own glowing review of Draper's Conflict, the volume he commissioned and published, as well as responses to the book's critics. After noting, with a publisher's pecuniary delight, that critics have, quote, "execrated it into about thrice the circulation that it would otherwise have had," Yeomans claimed that such criticism came specifically from, and I quote here, "the outside sects, Jews, Unitarians, and Catholics, whom the Orthodox repudiate as knowing nothing of true religion." Now, what proportion of Yeomans' advocacy consists of honestly held opinions, and what proportion represents a publisher desirous of hawking his wares is open to discussion. But it seems unlikely that the latter motivation was entirely lacking. What remains unclear to me is how much of the conflict metaphor and the melodramatic tone of Draper's book was actually Yeomans' influence. Because Draper's previous books are not melodramatic. In fact, they're really dull. And you get to this book and it's written in an entirely different style. So I wonder to what extent Yeomans actually tarted up the text to make it a more risque, a better seller. But he's a key player here. Okay, so let me just conclude briefly and then we'll have time for some more questions or questions on what you read. In White's case, we find a person stung by criticism regarding his actions in the founding of Cornell and lashing out with over-the-top responses. Draper's attacks, in contrast, are part of a coherent philosophical perspective developed over the course of 30 years. And his conflict espouses not just a religion of science, but a distinct religion of his own devising, replete with its own theology and metaphysics. A metaphysics, by the way, that we will see return in 20th century scientism. So when I talk later, I'll talk a little bit more about where these books go in the 20th century, because I got you down to the end of the 19th century. We're still 120 years away from the present. Do these books still have any impact whatsoever? Well, I can answer that, yes. They are still both in print. They are both available online, and people quote from them constantly. So, all right, so that's enough for the topic today, for the first lecture. I'll just open the floor for any more questions that we have. One other I thought I would mention to you, I don't know how many of you may have seen it or not, but there was a retread of the 1970s series Cosmos that came out recently. Oh, I see some people laughing, and you must have seen it. Well, in the first episode, if you've seen it, you'll remember. If you haven't seen it, I'll tell you about it. The scientific narrative is interrupted with a cartoon sequence about Giordano Bruno, wherein all the churchmen are portrayed as shadowy, dark-skinned, beetle-browed fiends spouting ignorant declarations against the blessed angel of light, Giordano Bruno. Actually, the fact is Bruno was from Calabria, so he was actually probably darker than they were. But the claim that Bruno was executed for scientific notions has repeatedly been refuted by numerous scholars, but this sequence was taken almost entirely out of Draper and White. Now, I'll tell you something very funny that I noticed, and this is why you should never go watch things with a historian. So there's this bizarre scene up in the top with the bishop with glowing eyes, where Bruno goes into his cell, right, he's a Dominican friar. He takes up the floorboard and picks a book out that he's hiding in the floor and starts reading it secretly. And when in bursts the bishop, who for some reason or other is wearing his mitre in the middle of the night in a Dominican priory, and has him arrested, and eventually Bruno is burned at the stake. Now, you see the book here. You can see the edges of the book. I couldn't get a good shot of that, but what the graphic artist did was to take an actual page out of a 16th century manuscript and drop it in on the book. Now, the book that he is supposedly reading in secret, that he supposedly gets executed for reading, is De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, by the 1st century Roman poet Lucretius, which is somewhat atheistic and atomistic and so forth. Now, when I saw this is particularly why you shouldn't watch things with a medievalist, I said, damn, that manuscript page looks familiar to me. I have seen that somewhere before. And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it. I was like, no, it can't be. No, it couldn't be. That would be too ironic. Well, I checked. I said, that's a page from a presentation copy of De Rerum Natura. And I looked it up, and sure enough, it was. It was the presentation copy of De Rerum Natura that was given to Pope Sixtus V. And this is the book that, don't do things unless you know what to do. Anyway, just another example of this poor guy here is Charles Borromeo. There's a somewhat better picture of him, but just the sort of racist caricatures of people in this. I mean, I can't believe that it was actually broadcast and no one complained about it. Well, people probably did complain, but anyway, pretty shocking. So the persistence of the conflict model in the face of innumerable refutations by historians has led to it being called the myth that wouldn't die. There's a book actually out called The Myth That Wouldn't Die, which is responses to Draper and White. So the question for now is why? Why does it persist? How did it come to achieve such seeming immortality in our own days? Well, given what we've seen in the modern political arena, perhaps the relative unimportance of reality to majority opinion doesn't require any special explanation. but I'm gonna try it anyway. Well, for a myth to survive, it seems to me that two things are required. It must play some important role without reference to its truth value. And second, it must have persons willing to repeat and/or embellish it to keep it alive and fresh, which once again means it's playing some useful, even if misguided, role. So let's look first at the 19th century context and then the 20th century. So one role that a popular story or myth can play is reinforcing or articulating pre-existing ideas. In the late 19th century, Draper's book certainly did just that. I've already said much of its initial popularity, at least in the United States, came from its strident anti-Catholicism. Both Draper and White also fed into late 19th century ideas of progress, of the emergence of a new technological age made possible through science. So just think about what's going on in the late 19th century, right? We're not that far from Thomas Edison's laboratories, so that's a very good example. The electric light, the phonograph, the motor car, mass production, and all the other innovations that made that material, that period, what I think is arguably the most technologically transformative to daily life in history, perhaps even more than our own. I might be willing to argue that period from about 1880 to 1920, those 40 years saw some of the most dramatic changes in daily life due to technology. So the story told by Draper and White also proved useful when it was co-opted into political and social schemes. In Europe, their books became manifestos, as I mentioned before, for political secularizers. They fit perfectly into their plans for establishing increasingly secular governments and even providing justifications for the sometimes violent seizure of property and power held by the clergy. And this was nowhere more evident, as I said before, than in Italy, where political anti-clericalism was at a fever pitch following Garibaldi's unification of Italy, where Rome and the rest of the papal states had been seized, the Pope imprisoned in the Vatican, and many Italian religious institutions dispersed or secularized. And speaking of Bruno for a second, some of you may know that there's a statue of Bruno in the Campo dei Fiori, where he was burnt at the stake. When was that put up, and by whom? It was put up exactly at this time when the Pope was imprisoned in the Vatican, and it was put up by the Freemasons. Right? So history does explain things to us. All right. I would also like to suggest that the myth remains so strong today in large part because it is a myth, in the positive sense of that word. Despite Draper and White's explicit use of a military metaphor, especially White, they implicitly, and I don't know whether this was conscious or unconscious, we can't say now, they borrowed the imagery that characterizes the history of religion. They created a litany of martyrs, a hagiography of oppressed visionaries. They recast scientists as prophets and priests, the recipients of special enlightenment who struggled to spread the gospel of science and technology against the darkness and ignorance of the pagans, that is, against the old priesthood of religion. So, what does this mean? In this way, they co-opted for themselves all the drama and emotional power of the story of early Christians persecuted by, but ultimately victorious over, Roman paganism. So the tale of the conflict of science and religion, I believe, has come to operate as an origin myth for science. An origin myth for science. And it lays the foundations for setting up science as a religion of its own. And I think comparison to the social dynamics of myth and folklore far better explains the continuing strength and popularity of the warfare model than any other kind of explanation. We'll see this mechanism more. What I asked you to read for tomorrow for the Galileo is this outstanding article by Professor Lessel on the folklore relating to Galileo. I think, honestly speaking, as a historian of science, I could have given you lots of things written by my colleagues about Galileo. Instead, which is written by a professor of rhetoric and communication, I think it's one of the best articles ever written on Galileo and the Galileo affair. I think it's just super. Now, slightly in anticipation of that issue, To drive this point home visually, I'm going to show you two things. Here we have Roberto Bellarmino, who had a famous discussion with Galileo about the motion of the Earth. He is canonized now. And if you go to the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome, he was a Jesuit, you can there see and venerate his corporal relics. However, if you go to Florence, you can there go and see and venerate the corporal relics of Galileo Galilei, martyr of science. That's his finger in a jar, by the way. Unfortunately, it is the middle finger. But yes, and you can see over here, you can see so well, here's someone venerating the bit of Galileo. So this is what I'm trying to show, sort of science. Here you have a martyr, you have his corporal relics in what is in fact a reliquary. Actually, when the Galileo Museum in Florence redid their display, there was an article in the Italian newspapers about Galileo's finger, it's everybody's favorite. And an ancient family said, "Oh, we have two of his teeth, would you like those too?" So now they've got two of his teeth as well. So the holy relics are coming back together again. Right, he's buried just down the road in Santa Croce anyway. The initial utility of this origin myth, of science is the late 19th century rise of the professional scientist and concern over his social status and authority. In the 19th century, the very word scientist was still a neologism. Many people don't realize that the word scientist, we know exactly when it was coined, 1838, and it was coined as a joke. At the British Association for the Advancement of Science, someone said, well, what do we call ourselves? And one wag said, well, people who do art call themselves artists, and so people who do science will call ourselves scientists, and everybody laughed. And in fact, as late as 1925, the journal Nature refused to publish the word scientist because they thought it was, quote, a vulgar American neologism. In fact, it was British and it is 19th century, but few people could be called professional scientists in that they earned their living by what we see as scientific endeavors. Colleges and universities focused primarily on the liberal arts, and the academic pathway for becoming a scientist was only beginning to develop. We had mentioned in one of the questions the founding of my own university in 1876, which is the first place, so it's 1876, same year as Draper's book, first place where PhDs in the sciences were regularly given, and it established for that purpose. So the consequence is the social position of the emerging professional scientist was far from clear. Who was he? What did he do? I say he in this case because, of course, they were only men at that point. Where did he fit into society? What established or guaranteed the scientist's authority? So scientists, if I can use that word, needed to craft an identity for themselves, to carve out a stable, preferably high, social position, and invest themselves with an authoritative voice. The Draper and White myth provided a very convenient tool for doing so. It delivered authority to scientists by appropriating it, by co-opting it from the already well-established authority of religion. The priests of God were the authority figures guiding social and political currents of the past. But according to this myth, the priests of natural science had confounded the priests of religion, will take over their mantle or their collars and be the authority figures to guide new social and political currents of the future. Since Draper and White made it so perfectly clear that scientists had defeated religionists at every turn, it followed naturally that scientists had succeeded in displacing religionists and seizing their cultural position of authority. I want to say one thing as an aside at this point. The one thing that I did not mention, the one fatal argument against the Draper and White books, we can pick at all of their dubious facts one at a time. But the most substantial overarching criticism is that they are assuming that the emerging social divisions of the 19th century, of their own day, existed back through time. That there was a camp of religionists and a camp of scientists in the past, going back to Roman antiquity. This is completely false. This is completely false. That social division of people doing the work simply didn't exist. And I'll say a great deal more about this when I talk about the scientific revolution, about the people who are doing theology and who are doing the sciences were one and the same. So their basic idea of a warfare between two groups is vitiated by the fact that historically those two groups did not exist as such. They could not have existed as such in the past. All right, well, nowadays the struggle for political and social authority continues, I think, to undergird this science-religion controversy. And so it extends the utility of the Draper-White narratives. So think about some contemporary examples from, let's say, evolution to the age of the universe. If you scratch the surface of these contemporary conflicts, one will virtually always find concerns about social, political, and often financial status. One fundamentalist rather recently said, perhaps slightly too honestly, that the recent arguments over evolution were really about, and I quote, who gets to sit at the head of the table? Indeed, who decides what is taught and to whom? Whose ideas are taken seriously by government leaders? Whose work is supported financially from public funds and otherwise? So for scientists, the myth lends identity, pedigree, and position. But there's a great deal more to the story. The notion of an inherent incompatibility between science and religion and the struggle for socio-political authority was propagated by a very surprising cast of characters down through the 20th century and to our own day. And the trigger, I think, for this new stage was the horror of the First World War. As the first technological war, replete with chemical weapons, airplane bombings, mechanized tanks, and an array of new and horrible weaponry, unprecedented destruction of life and property, it scarred a generation and forced a rethinking of where human society was headed. It's somehow difficult to us become inured to the horrors of mechanical, chemical, technological war today to realize the impact that World War I actually had in the teens and the 20s. For our present purposes, two significant but divergent responses emerged. One of them I will call the technologist current, populated by those who became convinced by the horrors of the war that the social, political, and moral systems of the past could no longer guarantee peace and had to be replaced by scientific thinking and technology in order to reformulate human society scientifically and technologically for efficiency and peace. And here, I think, we catch a reprise of Auguste Comte and his positivist philosophy, a current that itself reemerged in the late teens and the 1920s. Late 1920s, there's a resurgence of logical positivism, which takes Comte's positivistic ideas and applies them particularly to the way science is done. For most of these technologists, their views included two things: socialist politics and materialist ideology. And their vision included such things as a world government and, strikingly, the abolition of religion, not only as a relic of the past, but a stumbling block for the future. Now, it must be said that neither Draper nor White ever said we should get rid of religion. Draper wanted us to get rid of Catholicism, but he didn't even think that was a real religion, so maybe it doesn't count. But White certainly had this liberal Protestant stance. Draper, his father was a Methodist minister, and he does say that Protestantism is the twin sister of science. So neither of them want to get rid of religion. But these new technologists seem to want to do just that. And that seems to be an early 20th century phenomenon. They depended closely on the tale told by Draper and White. I'll get to that in just a second. The other current sought a reassertion of humanity's spirituality and moral and religious values, concluding that the immoral brutality of the First World War was due instead to materialist, atheist, and scientistic outlooks. So let's talk about the technologist current, or what I also call the techno-utopians. So who are these people? Well, a key player was H.G. Wells. He's remembered today primarily as a science fiction writer because of his books of the 1890s, Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, Time Machine. But his post-war writings are actually far more influential, even though nobody reads them today. His best-selling book was actually his Outline of History, published in 1919, which has been called, I think probably reliably by one author, the best-selling history book of all time. His outline follows an oversimplifying reductionist strategy, just like Draper's, and repeatedly casts religion, Christianity in particular, as the enemy of human progress. Now, to what extent Wells actually literally relied on Draper and White is unclear, but I've read these books several times. The episodes that he chooses to tell and the narrative style that he employs sounds so much like Draper and White that I'm certain that those were right next to him while he was writing Outline of History. His narrative, which runs from the Neolithic until World War I, is built upon a stark bifurcation between science, technology, and progress on one side and religion on the other. Again, contemporaneous professional historians panned the work, but this didn't keep it from becoming a worldwide bestseller. Now, as the socialist and materialist current of which Wells was a part intensified through the 1920s, he published in 1923 Men Like Gods, about a utopia where science flourishes and religion has essentially died away. And in 1933, The Shape of Things to Come. Anyone actually read Shape of Things to Come? Maybe you've seen one of the movies. If you've seen one of the movies, it's nothing like the book at all. Neither of the two movies. In the book, a long world war is followed by a plague that wipes out most of humanity. A world government is set up, which then first eliminates Islam by blowing up all the mosques, save a handful that have architectural value. The Pope and the Catholic hierarchy are then invited to a meeting, sealed in a room and gassed to death. Protestants, by the way, are never mentioned, I should just say. Finally, the world government is overthrown and a worldwide council of scientists builds a utopian society. Now, one might see this as a horrific dystopic vision of life gone wrong, but the really horrific part of it is what it seems to be what Wells and his compatriots actually thought was necessary. Already in 1905, in his Little Red, A Modern Utopia, Wells wrote of the inherent superiority of a few people, a new elite he dubbed the samurai, who are scientists and technologists who could lead the ignorant masses, whose numbers needed to be reduced, forward. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, he published The World Set Free, another utopian story about a new atomic war that would lead to a reduction of the human population, the overthrow of the established order to be replaced by a scientific, technological utopia. Utopias emerge, according to Wells and his like-minded colleagues, when scientists put themselves unopposed at the head of the table. So once again, scientists' concern about their social position and authority reappears. All right, well, as one would hope, such visions did not fail to elicit criticism, and surely the most famous criticism of Wellesian utopias was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. The book infuriated Wells, who called it, now pay attention to the language he used, it infuriated him because he called it a blasphemy against science. So now we're back again to this thing as science standing in the place of religion. Aldous' brother Julian also responded, although in less literary ways, observing that, quote, science is now in danger of setting itself up as an external code or framework, as did revealed religion in the past. For Julian, who was not a supporter of theistic religion, the solution lay in what he called scientific humanism. If you're ever concerned about the vast distinction between humanism of the Italian Renaissance and the so-called secular humanism of today, it goes back to this scientific humanism, which is a term coined by Julian Huxley, which has been summarized by one of my colleagues as, quote, the identification of human progress with the permeation of science through society. Well, in the event, Huxley's scientific humanism, although it wasn't as stark and hegemonic as the views he critiqued, came over time to lie closer and closer to, rather than further from, socialist materialist visions. One of Huxley's collaborators marked bluntly how he finally realized that, quote, scientific humanism is to be regarded as the formulation of a new religion. So once again, we're not at a conflict between science and religion, we're at a conflict between two conflicting religions. Well, many scientists of the period and the succeeding period shared Wells's views, particularly several biochemists who made assertions about the nature of life, and their confidence that they were close to uncovering its secret. For example, J.D. Bernal, the noted X-ray crystallographer, as well as a staunch communist and atheist, asserted in 1936, quote, the secret of life lies in the structure of proteins, and X-ray crystallography is the only way to solve it. He added, rather ominously, that, quote, life has ceased to be a mystery, it has become a utility. His contemporary and equally enthusiastic supporter of the Soviet Union, the geneticist J.B.S. Haldane, held and voiced similar views about life. Here's a picture of Haldane haranguing a mob of his communist adherents. Both Bernal and Haldane were also science popularizers. Beware the science popularizer. We need more science popularizers, but we need a great deal more good science popularizers, not bad ones. They wrote numerous works that expressed their views to the general public. The debate over the nature of life from World War I until the 1960s served as the illustration of a larger battle between a group of materialist scientists and those who saw life as having a greater significance beyond the rearrangements of chemical entities. And, this is important, the arguments over life were very consciously engaged in as a struggle between science and religion, explicitly, certainly by Haldane and by Bernal. Thus it prompts me to suggest the text of Draper and White, whose popularity and citation had not decreased throughout the period, acted as blueprints for what would become a warfare of science and religion, regardless of the fact that their descriptions of the past were fictional. And you see the difference, that they're talking about this warfare has always been going on, they're wrong, yet by saying it, by adding this metaphor, this image, this account to popular culture, they essentially gave blueprints for a science-religion war that came to exist that we still feel the effects of today. Right. It's the socialist, materialist, and scientific utopianist currents of the interwar period, drawing strength from the narratives of Draper, White, and Wells, and impetus from scientists' unease with their social and political position that I think comprise the chief foundations of modern scientism. And by scientism, I mean the exclusionary and reductionist belief that science and its methods provide the only fully valid route to gaining knowledge and for answering questions, to the exclusion of any other methods or disciplines. So it is exclusionary in the sense that only science, as we understand and pursue it, is capable of providing valid and acceptable answers to all questions, and that all questions it cannot answer are either meaningless or not worth asking. And here, once again, I think there's an inheritance from the logical positivism of the 1920s, which argued that in the science, all we can have are observational terms. All we can do is make an observation and describe what we see. Anything else is what they call metaphysical, and anything metaphysical it's not just wrong, it is literally devoid of meaning. Their example is, all metaphysics has the truth value of the statement, Caesar is a prime number, right? It just doesn't make sense. So logical positivism eventually died a lingering death at the hands of philosophers who showed that it was internally inconsistent and that all of our observations are actually theory-laden. We can't observe anything without having an idea in mind of what we're going to see first. Nevertheless, I think some of this logical positivism is at the foundations of modern scientism. But that's because, as I said before, the people who indulge in scientism have very little philosophical training. It is reductionist scientism, that is, in the sense that everything is reducible to and explicable by such science and its principles. So let me give you some examples. Consider the recent attempt by some sociobiologists to reduce human religiosity to the expression of a religiosity gene. Now, one of my very dear colleagues, in fact, the last reading I gave to you by John Brooke, I was at a conference with him when someone said that there's a religiosity gene for people who are religious. And his response was, oh, I'm not going to do his, he has a beautiful Oxford accent, but I won't try to reproduce that. He said, oh, well, I will believe that as soon as someone identifies the gene and turns it on in Richard Dawkins. As other illustrations of scientific utterances, consider Stephen Hawking's claim that, quote, philosophy is dead. Why? Because science is the only legitimate way to answer questions, so we don't need philosophy anymore. It would take a normal person about 3 seconds to come up with questions that science has no way of answering. Of course, the response would be that those questions are meaningless or irrelevant. The physical chemist, another chemist to be ashamed of, Peter Atkins, I had to survive through his physical chemistry book when I was an undergraduate, so I automatically don't like it. Asserts plainly that science has, quote, universal competence to resolve all questions whatsoever. Now, perhaps I should pass over in silence the fact that scientism's loudest proponents fail to have any clear or consistent notion of what science actually means, but that would be another lecture. As for the arrogance that is the customary traveling companion of scientism, I cite Stephen Weinberg's recent To Explain the World. Anybody read that? Good. Just to give you the quick Cliff Notes version, he brushes off Plato as silly, Parmenides and Zeno as intellectually lazy, and Aristotle as tedious. All is propaedeutics to celebrating modern scientific prowess, particularly his own. I've rarely seen such a self-indulgent exercise of ego. And here it is used to mask a profound ignorance of the history of science. And unsurprisingly, he repeats Draper and White wholesale, setting religion and science as irreconcilable opposites and asserting once again that Christianity has been the obstacle to human progress. Of course, to make such claims, it's like, why the hell do I do what I'm doing? He has to ignore the past 60 years of professional history of science to revive discredited 19th century notions. But this is why it's the myth that won't die. My colleagues and I have been working on this problem for 60 years. Do they read us? I mean, we're not all bad writers. No, this is what I mean about the whole science religion thing, the myth being so embedded in human culture, but we can't even get out the nonsense about Columbus and the flat earth. And that doesn't really do anybody any good. The science religion myth is actually doing work for people. on both sides of the divide nowadays, even more unfortunately, which I'll get to in a second. Right, so here we can see the continuing dependence of some scientists on the myth of the conflict of science and religion as a foundation myth, as an origin myth, not just for science itself, but more viscerally for their own personal identity. And I don't mean that entirely as a kind of smart aleck remark. I don't really, because in fact, the scientific establishment has had its social and political status shaken in the last generation. We are no longer in the heady days of the immediate post-war period with positive views of science and technology. We're in a science-critical era. Postmodernist critiques and the science wars of the 1990s assailed the supposedly unique authoritative character of science and societal role. Disillusionment over the failure of science to solve humanity's problems and bring peace and prosperity, criticism over pick your poisons, pollution, and that old standby of American culture, anti-intellectualism, and their new regime of alternative facts weakened the position that science and scientists had steadily been achieving since the late 19th century. So scientists today do find themselves threatened and diminished in public stature. Hence, we had to have, 3 or 4 years ago, a march for science. A march for science? Science needs a march? Well, this sort of diminishment begs for the support of a grand foundational story. And I fear that the science-religion myth is not only the closest to hand, but actually may become rather more than less deployed in the future. The displacement from the center, however, reminds me of one feature of the other current that I mentioned emerged from World War I, and suggests a very curious similarity between opposing ends of the spectrum. So the two currents were one towards scientific technological, the other towards moral and religious renewal. In the latter case, in the United States, the wars in humanity galvanized the budding fundamentalist movement. American fundamentalism emerged on the eve of the First World War against an array of social, demographic, and political shifts, including urbanism, the shift from an agrarian to an industrial base, the influence of non-Anglo-Saxon Protestant immigrants, and that mainline Protestant theologies that by 1900 had largely accepted biblical higher criticism and evolution. It comes as a surprise to most people to know that before the rise of fundamentalism in the very early 20th century, by the 1890s, almost all Christian denominations had come to some kind of accommodation of Darwinian evolution. It was not a problem in general in Catholicism, but most Protestant denominations also, including, this is the one that always strikes, we live in such a weird time. The founder of the doctrine, the Protestant doctrine of biblical inerrancy, B.B. Warfield, a Baptist minister, had no problem with Darwinian evolution. In fact, he wrote that human beings are no less human and created in God's image because we evolved from animals than the wine that Jesus made at Cana was any less wine because it had once been water. Right? This is the founder of biblical inerrancy. And yet, by 1900, evolution was no longer a problem. People still had questions about the mechanism of evolution because we didn't have genetics. So we had no idea how the inheritance of character, the inheritance acquired, how inheritance worked. So that was still a problem to be solved soon after by that Croatian Benedictine. It was a reactionary movement, fundamentalism, by those who found themselves displaced from the center of American culture, thought, and society. Its more thoughtful supporters quickly attributed the barbarity of the war to the rise of materialist ideologies and the slippage of religious orthodoxy, and saw religious revival as the antidote. Those concerned about the future of civil society, like William Jennings Bryan at the 1925 Scopes trial, were not motivated primarily at this time by dissonance with literal readings of Genesis 1, but rather by what they saw as the dehumanizing effects of promoting humanity's animal origins as expressed in Darwinian evolution. If human beings are just animals, then what's the moral prohibition against mistreating or simply killing off the inconvenient ones? And remember, this is also in the context of the 1920s eugenics movement, of which Wells was also a supporter. This more thoughtful attitude did not persist within US fundamentalism after the 1920s, and when anti-evolutionary fundamentalism revived in the 1960s as a direct response to the new science curricula, I think I was one of the last people who got the BSSC curriculum in biology. Some of you may know that in the shock after Sputnik in 1957, the federal government mandated a new set of science textbooks for the United States. The PSSC for physics, CSSC for chemistry, BSSC, biological science secondary curriculum, I think it's called. And it was that biology, the text Molecules to Man, is the name of the text. Some of you may know of it. And when that permeated into, good, I'm in New Jersey, I can say this, less enlightened parts of our nation, particularly the South and the Midwest, that's what sparked again anti-evolution and the fundamentalist movement in America. And those books did not survive in curricula for very long. PSSC, because physics is far away enough from life and anything oral, I suppose, that survived. Anyway, I can talk more about that. It was in response to these that anti-evolutionary fundamentalism became more confrontational towards science itself and used biblical literalism as the main argument, a situation that has remained largely unchanged to our day, and a continuing source of support for the erroneous idea that science and religion have to be, and have always been, in conflict. So my point here is twofold. I wonder again to what line the battle lines drawn by Draper and White and reinforced by their interwar heirs molded the shape of what we are witnessing today. And second, what we witness today is not really a cosmic battle between science and religion. Rather, in its modern manifestation, it is a very noisy and over-well publicized and dramatized struggle between scientism and fundamentalism. Furthermore, it strikes me that these two opposite ends of the spectrum, scientism and fundamentalism, sprout from common origins. And I don't just mean the lines of descent drawn from World War I, but rather the insecurity of their advocates in regard to their social and political position arising from perceived diminution of their place and authority within society. And that's not where the similarity ends. I am particularly struck by the arrogance of both groups, both of whom presume to represent realms of thought that should instill humility and a recognition of human limitations before the incomprehensible grandeur of the universe and the unfathomable mystery of existence. Instead, these two groups compete to give trivial, simplistic, idiotic, dismissive answers to complex and perhaps unanswerable questions. And in so doing, they not only preempt more considered and sophisticated thoughts, but also alienate everybody else. Both sides presume to speak for larger groups that they don't legitimately represent. Obviously, I don't have to say so speaking to this group, Christian fundamentalists do not speak for all Christians. Scientistic fundamentalists do not speak for the entire enterprise of scientific inquiry or for the whole population of scientists, most of whom, at least the ones I know, would prefer to be left alone without being caught up in political and philosophical issues that are both outside their interests and beyond their realm of competence. That said, I fear it's going to be difficult to dispense with the myth that wouldn't die so long as it serves a useful function. For scientists, insecure about their social and political position, for fundamentalists, insecure about their political clout and the size of their congregation, and recently, for the new atheists, insecure about their choice of religion. But in my personal experience, it really hasn't been productive to work on either end of the spectrum. And here I think of my favorite quotation from one of my favorite 19th century writers, Mark Twain, that great American, who says, "Never try to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and it annoys the pig." But that leaves for audience, however, the great majority in the middle, who can be taught to view the supposedly inherent and eternal conflict of science and religion as a myth with very specific historical origins and developments. And so I have to end, guess what, with the historian's plea simply to get the history right. A better understanding of history will serve to strip away the rhetorical and fictional bases of the conflict thesis and reveal the surprising dynamics that have very frequently characterized the pursuit of both science and religion. I'll try to talk about some of those tomorrow in our historical day. It'll also reveal, as I've tried to outline to you today, how the myth, originally confected in the 19th century, was co-opted and deployed as a useful model during the 20th century in the context of political commitments to socialism, to the Soviet Union, to materialist ideologies, to atheism. And I would hope also that the inherent complexities of history would discommode the mind to accept simplistic reductionist stories told to it by fundamentalisms of all sorts, whether the scientific brand or the religious brand, and instead search more deeply for answers and understanding, which, after all, science and religion are really both about. Thank you.